It was just 2 days before Christmas, and Sadie, the Clark family's beloved 5-year-old golden retriever, had vanished without a trace. The blizzard that had descended upon their quiet mountain community seemed determined to erase any sign of the loyal companion who had been an integral part of their lives for the past 5 years. Tom Clark stood at the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he peered out into the swirling white abyss. His wife, Mandy, paced anxiously behind him, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Their children, 12-year-old Emily and 10-year-old Max, huddled together on the couch, their eyes wide with worry. Tom expressed the need to search for Sadie, his voice barely audible over the wind's mournful song. Mandy nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line as she reached for their heavy winter coats. As they stepped outside, the bitter cold hit them like a physical force. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the wind seemed to slice through their layers of clothing. Tom's flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam swallowed up by the falling snow just a few feet ahead. Mandy called out for Sadie, her voice quickly swallowed by the storm. The family trudged through the deepening snow, their calls growing more desperate with each passing minute. Emily and Max clung to each other, their young faces etched with concern for their furry friend. Hours passed and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The Clarks searched tirelessly, checking every possible nook and cranny where Sadie might have sought shelter. They peered into abandoned sheds, called down into drainage ditches, and scanned the edges of the nearby forest, all to no avail. As the night wore on, the temperature continued to drop. Tom could feel the cold seeping into his bones, his fingers numb despite his thick gloves. Mandy's teeth chattered audibly, and the children's cheeks were red and raw from the biting wind. Tom reluctantly suggested they head back, his heart heavy with the decision. He explained it was getting too dangerous to continue. Mandy looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, expressing her reluctance to give up. Tom reassured her, pulling her close and promising to resume the search at first light. The family made their way back home, the wind at their backs now, almost as if it were mocking their failed efforts. As they stepped inside, the warmth of their home felt like a betrayal. They couldn't help but feel guilty about being comfortable when Sadie was out there, alone in the cold. Imagine your beloved dog lost in the freezing cold, alone in a blizzard. What would you do? Would you search everywhere like this family did? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're as invested in this story as we are, hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional tales of hope, love, and incredible rescues. The next morning dawned gray and forbidding. The storm had intensified overnight, and the world outside their window was a blur of white. Tom's weather radio crackled with warnings of the worst blizzard to hit the area in decades. Despite the dire forecast, the Clarks bundled up once again and ventured out. They split into pairs, Tom with Max and Mandy with Emily, to cover more ground. They trudged through snow that was now knee-deep, calling Sadie's name, until their voices grew hoarse. As the day wore on, their hope began to fade like the weak winter sunlight. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the thought of Sadie out in this weather was almost too much to bear. By mid-afternoon, they were forced to regroup at home, exhausted and disheartened. Mandy made hot chocolate for the children, her movements mechanical as she tried to process the possibility that Sadie might not come back. Tom sat at the kitchen table, maps spread out before him. He'd marked off the areas they'd searched, his pen tracing possible routes Sadie might have taken, but with each passing hour, the chances of finding her seemed to grow slimmer. As Christmas Eve dawned, the storm finally began to lose some of its fury. The wind died down to a low moan, and the snowfall became less intense. The Clarks saw this as their chance, and set out once again, determination etched on their faces. They combed through the town, knocking on doors and asking neighbors if they'd seen any sign of Sadie. They posted flyers on lampposts and in shop windows, the paper quickly becoming damp in the falling snow. Emily and Max insisted on joining the search again, their young faces set with a determination that mirrored their parents'. They trudged through the snow-covered streets, calling Sadie's name until their voices were raw. As the short winter day began to wane, the family found themselves at the edge of town, near the old Johnson farm. The dilapidated barn loomed before them, its weathered wood almost lost in the swirling snow. Tom suggested Sadie might have sought shelter in the barn, his voice hoarse from hours of calling. They approached the structure, hope fluttering in their chests. Tom pushed open the creaking door, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He called out for Sadie, his voice echoing in the empty space. But the barn was as cold and lifeless as the world outside. No sign of Sadie, not even a paw print in the dust that covered the floor. As they exited the barn, the wind picked up again, driving needles of ice into their faces. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night approached, and Tom knew they couldn't stay out much longer. Tom reluctantly suggested they head back, his voice heavy with defeat. He explained it wasn't safe to be out after dark. Mandy looked at him, her eyes reflecting the pain they all felt. She softly reminded him that tomorrow was Christmas, and Sadie should be home for it. The children's faces fell at the reminder. Christmas had always been Sadie's favorite time of year. She would prance around the house with tinsel in her fur, steal ornaments off the lower branches of the tree, and curl up contentedly by the fire as they opened presents. The thought of celebrating without her was almost unbearable. As they made their way back through town, the Christmas lights that adorned the houses seemed to mock their sorrow. The cheerful displays felt out of place in the face of their grief. They trudged up their driveway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The warmth of their home enveloped them as they stepped inside, but it did little to thaw the chill that had settled in their hearts. Mandy mechanically began to prepare dinner while Tom helped the children out of their snow-covered clothes. The house felt eerily quiet, without Sadie's nails clicking on the hardwood floors or her tail thumping against the furniture. As they sat down to eat, the empty space where Sadie's food bowl usually sat seemed to loom large in the kitchen. The children picked at their food, their usual excitement for Christmas Eve dinner noticeably absent. After dinner, they half-heartedly went through the motions of their usual Christmas Eve traditions. They hung stockings by the fireplace, leaving Sadie's in its usual spot, unable to bear the thought of not including her. They set out cookies and milk for Santa, though the ritual felt hollow without Sadie trying to sneak a treat. As bedtime approached, Emily and Max reluctantly climbed the stairs to their rooms. Mandy tucked them in, her heart breaking at the sight of their tear-stained faces. Max asked about the possibility of Santa bringing Sadie back, his voice small and hopeful. Mandy swallowed hard, forcing a smile onto her face. She encouraged him to keep hoping, reminding him of Sadie's intelligence and strength, and the possibility of her finding her way home. After the children were in bed, Tom and Mandy sat in the living room, the only light coming from the twinkling Christmas tree. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken fears and dwindling hope. Mandy finally voiced their shared fear about Sadie not returning. Tom pulled her close, feeling her tears soaking into his shirt. He tried to reassure her, his own voice thick with emotion, insisting they had to believe Sadie would find her way home. As the clock struck midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day, the Clark family lay in their beds, exhausted and heartsick. The storm outside had quieted to a gentle snowfall, the world outside muffled and still. In the quiet of the night, they each said a silent prayer for their beloved Sadie, hoping against hope that somehow, some way, she would find her way back to them. As they drifted off into uneasy sleep, they clung to the last threads of hope, unaware that the Christmas morning that awaited them would bring a miracle they never expected. The faint light of Christmas morning crept through the windows of the Clark home, casting a soft glow on the untouched presents beneath the tree. The house was eerily quiet, the usual excitement of Christmas Day muted by Sadie's absence. Tom and Mandy lay in bed, neither wanting to face the day without their beloved pet. Suddenly, a familiar sound broke through the silence, the unmistakable bark of a golden retriever. Tom's eyes snapped open, and he sat up so quickly he nearly knocked Mandy out of bed. His voice, thick with sleep and hope, asked if she had heard the sound too. Before Mandy could respond, they heard it again, a frantic barking coming from outside. They scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over each other in their haste to get downstairs. As they reached the living room, Emily and Max were already at the window, their faces pressed against the glass. Emily's voice cracked with emotion as she announced Sadie's return. Tom flung open the front door, revealing Sadie standing in the snow-covered yard. Her golden coat was matted with ice and snow, and she looked exhausted, but her tail wagged furiously at the sight of her family. The family called out to Sadie in unison, rushing out onto the porch, but something was off. Instead of bounding towards them as she usually would, Sadie stayed where she was, barking insistently. Her body was tense and she kept looking back towards the house, then at her family. Tom took a step towards Sadie, questioning her unusual behavior. Sadie's barking intensified. She ran a few steps towards the family, then back towards the house, specifically towards the back door. It was clear she wanted them to follow her. Confused but trusting their pet, the Clarks followed Sadie as she led them around to the back of the house. Once there, she continued her frantic behavior, running between the family and the back door, barking all the while. Mandy, shivering in the cold morning air, expressed her confusion about Sadie's intentions. As if in answer, a low, ominous creaking sound emanated from above them. Tom looked up, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the roof sagging under the weight of the accumulated snow. Tom yelled for everyone to get back, grabbing Max and Emily and pulling them away from the house. No sooner had they moved than a thunderous crack split the air. The family watched in shock as a large section of the roof collapsed, sending a cascade of snow and broken timber crashing down exactly where they had been standing moments before. For a few seconds, no one moved, too stunned by what had just happened. Then, as realization dawned, they turned to look at Sadie, who had finally stopped barking and was sitting in the snow, watching them with her head tilted. Mandy whispered in amazement, tears forming in her eyes as she realized that somehow Sadie had known the roof was going to collapse. Tom nodded, his face pale, acknowledging that Sadie had come back to warn them and had saved their lives. The children rushed to Sadie, throwing their arms around her neck and burying their faces in her damp fur. Sadie's tail wagged weakly, and she leaned into their embrace, clearly exhausted but happy to be home. As the initial shock wore off, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. If Sadie hadn't returned when she did, if she hadn't been so insistent on getting them out of the house, they could have been seriously injured or worse. Tom, his voice shaky, suggested they needed to call for help. The fire department or a structural engineer to assess the damage. Mandy nodded, still holding on to Sadie as if afraid she might disappear again. She proposed they go inside first to warm up, especially Sadie. They made their way to the front of the house, carefully entering through the front door. The damage, while severe, seemed to be confined to the back portion of the house. Still, they didn't want to take any chances. Once inside, Mandy immediately set about tending to Sadie. She gently toweled off the dog's fur, checking for any injuries. Aside from being cold and tired, Sadie seemed to be in good health, a miracle considering she had been out in the blizzard for 2 days. Tom called the local fire department, explaining the situation. They promised to send someone out immediately to assess the damage and ensure the rest of the house was safe. As they waited, the family gathered in the living room, Sadie curled up in the middle of them on the rug in front of the fireplace. The Christmas tree lights twinkled softly, a reminder of the joy that had seemed so far away just hours before. Emily, her hand gently stroking Sadie's head, marveled at Sadie's timely return. Max, his eyes wide with wonder, declared Sadie a superhero dog. Tom and Mandy exchanged a look over their children's heads, both thinking the same thing, how close they had come to tragedy and how their loyal pet had saved them. When the fire department arrived, they confirmed what the family already knew. The weight of the snow, combined with some previously undetected structural damage, had caused the roof collapse. The firefighter in charge, a kind-faced man named Johnson, shook his head in amazement when they told him about Sadie's actions. He remarked that while he'd seen some incredible things in his time, a dog coming back after 2 days in a blizzard to warn her family was truly something special. As the day wore on, neighbors began to hear about what had happened. Despite it being Christmas Day, people came by to offer help and support. Some brought food, others offered tools and labor to help secure the damaged part of the house. The sense of community was overwhelming, a Christmas miracle in its own right. Through it all, Sadie remained by the family's side, accepting pets and treats from visitors, but never straying far from her people. It was as if she knew they needed her close, a tangible reminder of the disaster they had narrowly avoided. As evening fell and the last of the neighbors left, the Clark family sat around the Christmas tree. The presents, forgotten in the morning's excitement, still lay unopened. But somehow, they didn't seem as important anymore. The best gift of all was already there, curled up on the rug, her tail thumping gently against the floor. Sadie watched her family with interest, her brown eyes moving from person to person, as if making sure they were all still there, still safe. As Mandy handed out mugs of hot cocoa, Tom raised his in a toast to Sadie, his voice thick with emotion as he called her their Christmas guardian angel. The others echoed the sentiment, and Sadie's tail wagged at the sound of her name. Later that night, as the children slept and the house was quiet once more, Tom and Mandy sat on the couch, Sadie stretched out between them. The events of the day seemed almost unreal now, like a dream, or a nightmare key. They had narrowly escaped. Mandy, her hand absently stroking Sadie's fur, reflected on how much she had missed the little things about Sadie during her absence, the way she greeted them when they came home, how she always seemed to know when one of them was sad. Tom nodded, understanding exactly what Mandy meant. He marveled at how Sadie had topped all of that by saving their lives, wondering aloud how they could even begin to repay such an act. Mandy suggested that they didn't need to repay Sadie, believing that for Sadie, just being with them was enough. That's why she had come back after all. Tom agreed, leaning down to place a gentle kiss on Sadie's head and whispering a soft, "Merry Christmas," and "Thank you" to their loyal companion. As they sat there in the quiet of Christmas night, the Clark family felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had each other, they had their loyal Sadie, and they had been given the most precious gift of all, more time together. Outside, the stars twinkled brightly in the clear post-storm sky. The world was blanketed in white, peaceful and serene. And in a little house in Colorado, a family slept soundly, watched over by their faithful golden guardian.